In the realm of emotional stories, few narrated stories strike the heart quite like this one. A tale of quiet defiance, dignity, and unexpected strength in the most routine of places. An airplane cabin. Maya Brooks, a composed and independent woman, had selected her window seat with intention. It wasn't just a spot on a crowded Airbus. It was her small sanctuary in the sky. She had paid extra for the comfort, seeking a moment of peace amid the chaos of air travel. Her headphones were ready, a new novel in hand. Everything was set for a quiet flight. But as the final passengers boarded, Maya was interrupted by Gregory Wallace, a sharply dressed man exuding entitlement. With his young daughter in tow, he leaned in and, with a commanding tone masked as politeness, told Maya he needed her to move. His daughter, he explained, got anxious during flights and needed the window seat. It was a moment that would ignite a wave of confrontation, and one of the most touching stories about standing your ground. Maya, calm but firm, replied, "I'm sorry, sir. I paid for this seat." Gregory's demeanor shifted. His voice rose, now not just requesting but demanding, even attempting to shame her publicly. "She's a child," he declared, loud enough for the cabin to hear. "Surely you have some decency." What unfolded was more than a disagreement about a seat. It became one of those incredible stories where everyday people are tested in extraordinary ways. Maya didn't budge, and her resolve lit quiet flames of support among the passengers. Flight attendant Evelyn Carter arrived swiftly. Gregory tried to use his influence to force Maya out, but Evelyn stood her ground. "She has the assigned seat, sir," she said coolly. Gregory's frustration deepened, and murmurs began to ripple through the rows. That's when David Chun, a quiet man in a green hoodie, calmly voiced what many were thinking. She paid for her seat. More passengers began to show support. Laura Mitchell, across the aisle, reminded everyone that seats aren't random. You book what you need. It wasn't long before Marcus Reynolds, another flight attendant, joined Evelyn, with Gregory growing louder and more inappropriate. The crew warned him that any further disruption would lead to removal from the flight. He sneered at Maya, hissed insults, and finally, as the waves of justice surged, was escorted off the plane. This was more than a heartwarming story. It was a reminder of dignity in the face of arrogance. Maya's strength, Evelyn's professionalism, and the quiet courage of fellow passengers became part of an ongoing collection of justice stories. Stories where people, regardless of status or power, are reminded of the rules that protect us all. As the plane finally prepared for takeoff, Maya turned toward the window, her breath steady. Around her, a shared silence hummed, not just a relief, but respect. In a world where voices like Gregory's often drown out the rest, Maya's calm resistance was a chapter in the ever-growing book of unraveled fates, where the unexpected heroes are the ones who simply say no when it matters most. And though this wasn't the story of a black man fighting injustice today, it echoed the same spirit, that every person, regardless of who they are, deserves to be treated with fairness, respect, and humanity. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to our channel for more powerful and inspiring content. Your support helps us bring more stories that matter to life. Thank you for watching. As the boarding process neared its end, the hum of conversation and the shuffle of passengers filled the cabin of the Airbus. Maya Brooks sat calmly in her window seat, earbuds in hand and a new novel in her lap. She had specifically chosen and paid extra for this seat, a small luxury that promised her a peaceful flight. What she didn't anticipate, however, was the unexpected confrontation that would soon unfold. When Gregory Wallace stopped beside her row, Maya's initial thought was that he was simply passing through. But then he cleared his throat, his tone clipped and authoritative. "Excuse me," he said, gesturing to the seat next to hers. "My daughter needs a window seat." It wasn't a question, it was a statement. Maya looked up, momentarily surprised. She met the eyes of a man who carried himself like someone used to being obeyed. Expensive watch, tailored jacket, and the unmistakable confidence of privilege. His young daughter stood quietly beside him, eyes lowered, clutching a stuffed toy. Maya softened momentarily at the sight of the girl, but quickly redirected her attention to the man's expectant expression. "I'm sorry," she replied politely. "I paid for the seat." Gregory's expression hardened instantly. She gets anxious, he added, lowering his voice just enough to sound reasonable, but not enough to hide the edge of annoyance. I would think you have some compassion. When Maya remained firm, that's when his strategy shifted. He stood straighter and raised his voice, just enough to be heard by nearby passengers. This is what's wrong with people these days. No empathy, no basic decency. Heads began to turn. Whispers stirred. Maya felt the heat of unwanted attention as Gregory skillfully redirected the narrative. He wasn't just asking for a favor anymore. He was portraying her as cruel, unkind, and selfish. The subtle manipulation was unmistakable. Frame the scene so that the woman seated comfortably by the window would appear cold-hearted in the eyes of strangers. Gregory continued, addressing no one in particular, but making sure everyone heard. A grown woman who can't give up a seat for a little girl? Unbelievable. Maya stayed silent, aware that anything she said now could be twisted, taken out of context. She wasn't just battling for her seat anymore. She was resisting a public trial built entirely from assumptions and appearances. Gregory's voice carried a smug rhythm, dripping with moral superiority, and he played his role well. The concerned father, the voice of reason, the man wronged by a stranger's lack of compassion. But behind the facade, Maya could see it clearly. This wasn't about kindness. It was about control. Gregory wasn't concerned with his daughter's comfort. He was disturbed by being told no. It was a request. It was a test of obedience. And when Maya didn't fold, he escalated, hoping shame would succeed where reason had failed. It didn't, because Maya knew that standing her ground, even in silence, was enough. No raised voice, no outburst, just presence and principle. And eventually, it would be Gregory's manipulation, not Maya's refusal, that unraveled in front of everyone. The tension in the aircraft cabin was unmistakable, hovering in the air like static before a storm. Maya Brooks remained composed in her window seat, but the weight of Gregory Wallace's accusations was heavy. He had made it clear, loudly and repeatedly, that he believed she was selfish for not giving up her assigned seat for his daughter. His performance was intended to spark judgment, to paint himself as a reasonable parent and Maya as a cold, unfeeling stranger. But Maya was not alone. As murmurs began to ripple among passengers, a figure emerged down the aisle with measured, assertive steps. Evelyn Carter, the lead flight attendant, approached with calm authority. In her neatly pressed Navy uniform and no-nonsense expression, she had the presence of someone who had handled more difficult passengers than most could imagine. Her name tag glinted subtly under the cabin lights, but her posture was louder than words. She was in control. "Is there a problem here?" Evelyn asked, her tone even, eyes moving between Maya and Gregory. Gregory wasted no time jumping in. "Yes, there is. This woman is refusing to switch seats so my daughter can sit by the window." Evelyn raised her brows slightly, then turned to Maya. "Is this your assigned seat, ma'am?" "Yes," Maya replied calmly. "I selected and paid for this seat." Without missing a beat, Evelyn turned back to Gregory. "Sir, passengers are entitled to the seats listed on their boarding passes. She has every right to remain where she is." Gregory bristled. "I understand that, but I'm asking for basic decency here. I'm sure your airline values customer service." "We do, sir," Evelyn responded. "And part of that service is ensuring that passengers are not pressured to give up a seat they booked and paid for." The response was firm but fair. It didn't escalate the situation, yet it made the airline's position clear. Gregory, however, refused to back down. His voice grew louder, his words more pointed, as if hoping to rally the nearby passengers to his cause. "She's refusing to help a child. That's the kind of person she is," he said loudly enough for others to hear. Evelyn didn't flinch. Her hands were clasped in front of her, her stance unshaken. "Sir, I'm going to ask you to return to your assigned seat now." Gregory's jaw clenched. "This is ridiculous. I have a right to ask. And I have the responsibility to ensure this flight proceeds without unnecessary disruption," Evelyn replied. Her tone had cooled, now edged with finality. "Please take your seat." Still, Gregory hesitated. He glanced around, searching for support, but none came. The cabin had grown still. Then, As if on cue, another uniformed figure approached, Marcus Reynolds, another flight attendant, whose presence added quiet reinforcement to Evelyn's authority. "Is there an issue?" Marcus asked. "Handled," Evelyn said simply, before turning to Gregory once more. "Sir, this is your final warning. Please take your seat, or we will need to escalate this matter." Gregory stared at her for a long moment, his face burning with frustration. But even he understood when a battle couldn't be won. He turned abruptly and walked back down the aisle, daughter in tow. Maya let out a quiet breath. Evelyn offered her a nod. No smile, no platitude, just a subtle acknowledgement that said, "You were right to stand your ground." What began as a dispute over a seat quickly unraveled into something far more serious. Maya Brooks had held her ground with composure and grace, refusing to yield her paid-for-window seat to Gregory Wallace, a man who seemed to believe his demands carried more weight than policies or common courtesy. His frustration had simmered throughout the flight, but the breaking point came not from her silence, but from his own words. After being rebuffed by both Maya and flight attendant Evelyn Carter, Gregory returned to his seat, seething. Maya had hoped the confrontation was over. She returned to her book, her heart still pounding, trying to recenter herself after the emotional strain. But peace wouldn't last. Moments later, she noticed movement. Gregory stood up once again, ignoring the flight crew's instructions. He walked deliberately down the aisle toward her, eyes fixed in quiet fury. The nearby passengers watched with tense curiosity. It was no longer just about a child's window seat. This was personal now. He leaned over her row, his tone low but dripping with venom. "You must be really proud of yourself," he hissed, barely loud enough for others to hear. "Pretending to be the victim when we both know what's really going on." Maya stared at him, unmoving. She didn't need to ask what he meant. The implication was crystal clear, and it cut deeper than any of his previous accusations. Before she could respond, Evelyn Carter reappeared beside them, her posture rigid. "Sir, step away from the passenger seat now," she said sharply, her voice cutting through the cabin noise like a blade. Gregory lingered for a moment, testing the boundary, until another figure stepped into view. Marcus Reynolds, a tall, composed male flight attendant whose calm demeanor only heightened the seriousness of the situation. His arrival made it unmistakably clear. This was no longer a passenger dispute. It was an airline security concern. "Is there a problem here?" Marcus asked. "Not yet," Evelyn replied. "But I was just explaining that if this passenger refuses to comply, we will need to escalate." Marcus nodded, his expression unreadable. "Sir, I need you to return to your seat immediately," he said with quiet authority. Gregory glared at them both, his pride clearly wounded. But the pressure was closing in. Passengers watched the unfolding scene with wide eyes and uneasy expressions. It wasn't just Maya who felt the shift in the air. Everyone on board sensed something had gone too far. And then Gregory made one final, damning mistake. As he walked away, he muttered under his breath. It was soft, but clear enough for Evelyn and Marcus to catch. A slur, an unmistakable word laced with racial undertones. Evelyn's head snapped up. Marcus's jaw tightened. Without hesitation, Marcus lifted his radio. "Captain, we have a situation." The message was short, but its weight was enormous. This was now a matter for the cockpit. Evelyn stepped forward, addressing Gregory directly. "Sir, I need you to collect your belongings. You're being removed from this flight." For the first time, Gregory's defiance faltered. He stood still, stunned, before realizing the gravity of what he'd triggered. The murmurs in the cabin rose to a wave. There was no defense left for him to hide behind. He had crossed the line, and there was no turning back. The cabin was heavy with silence, the kind that settled in only after tension had reached its breaking point. Gregory Wallace had crossed every line, refusing to yield, refusing to sit down, and ultimately refusing to show even a shred of humility. After the final warning had been issued by Marcus Reynolds and Evelyn Carter, the consequences could no longer be avoided. Gregory returned to his seat, but only physically. His presence remained hostile, his posture rigid, jaw clenched tight as if he still believed he could reclaim control. His daughter, small and silent beside him, clutched her stuffed rabbit, eyes wide with confusion and discomfort. but what he did next ensured the situation wouldn't end quietly. A few moments passed, just enough time for the cabin to begin breathing again, when Gregory muttered something loud enough for the nearby crew to hear. It wasn't just bitterness. It was a thinly veiled insult. Evelyn's expression froze. Marcus didn't need to ask twice. He stepped forward, voice firm and final. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to gather your belongings. You're being removed from this flight." A collective gasp rippled through the cabin. Passengers glanced up from their books, paused their conversations, and turned to witness what had become inevitable. Maya Brooks sat motionless, watching not with triumph, but with calm resolve. This wasn't about winning. It was about dignity and the right to not be bullied into silence. Gregory's face flushed deep red. "You've got to be kidding me," he said through clenched teeth, rising to his feet. "No, sir," Marcus replied coolly. "This is your final notice." His daughter looked up at him, clearly unsure of what was happening. He yanked his briefcase from under the seat and grabbed their coats from the overhead bin with sharp, exaggerated movements, as if trying to maintain some illusion of power. But the authority in that moment belonged entirely to the crew. As he shuffled down the aisle, the silence cracked under hushed murmurs and sidelong glances. A few passengers shook their heads, some whispering words like "unbelievable" or "about time." Laura Mitchell, the woman across from Maya, met her eyes briefly and gave a small, supportive nod. From behind, David Chen's voice could be heard in a low tone. He brought that on himself. Gregory didn't acknowledge anyone. His gaze was fixed ahead, avoiding eye contact, though his pride was still trying to keep his shoulders square. But there was no mistaking the defeat in his walk. The slow, angry steps of someone who believed he'd never be challenged, now humble before a plane full of strangers. As he approached the exit, Evelyn waited with a composed stance. She didn't speak, didn't need to. Her message had already been delivered, with professionalism and resolve. The flight door was opened, and Gregory stepped through, still fuming, dragging his daughter behind him. Just before the door closed, he cast one last look over his shoulder, but it held no threat, only the recognition that his authority had been stripped away. As the plane settled again, Maya exhaled for the first time in what felt like hours. Around her, the quiet buzz of conversation returned, but the energy had shifted. No one applauded, no one cheered. But justice had been done, and that was enough. Among the many emotional stories that unfold in silence after the chaos, Maya Brooks' moment of stillness by the airplane window spoke louder than any outburst ever could. The situation was over. Gregory Wallace had been escorted off the plane. The passengers had returned to their routines, some flipping through magazines, others whispering recaps of the confrontation. But Maya sat unmoving, the hum of the aircraft barely registering in her ears. She wasn't angry. She wasn't relieved either. What she felt was something quieter, deeper, a fatigue that came not from confrontation, but from always having to defend her right to simply exist with dignity. This was never just about a seat. It had become a mirror of something much bigger, a reflection of how easily society turns on a black woman the moment she says no and means it. It was one of those narrated stories that doesn't need exaggeration to feel powerful. Its truth is its weight. As she looked out the window, Maya didn't feel like a hero. She felt human, a woman who had dared to choose herself in a world that constantly asked her to yield. The seat she refused to give up was a metaphor for boundaries, for autonomy, for the invisible battles that black women fight every day in the most ordinary settings. The echoes of Gregory Wallace's voice still lingered in her memory, but they didn't sting as sharply anymore. His tactics, the manipulation, the shaming, the subtle prejudice, were not new. They were just louder this time. And though Maya had stayed composed, it came at a cost. Choosing to remain seated was more exhausting than it should have been. And yet, she didn't regret it. Not for a second. Because in that moment, she had been the author of her own chapter in what many would now call one of those touching stories that stir quiet reflection. A small act of defiance that rippled through the cabin, turning discomfort into awareness. She had sparked what felt like waves of justice, subtle yet undeniable, shifting the energy of the entire plane. When Evelyn Carter and Marcus Reynolds had stepped in, Their professionalism had turned what could have been a painful injustice into one of those rare justice stories where the right thing actually happened. Laura Mitchell's soft support and David Chen's calm defense reminded Maya that while she may have felt alone, she hadn't been. It was, in its own quiet way, a heartwarming story. Not because it was free of conflict, but because it ended with truth being honored. This moment would never be viral. It wouldn't make headlines, but it would remain part of something bigger. The lived experiences, the unraveled fates of everyday people who choose not to bend when the world expects them to. And as the plane lifted into the air, Maya finally allowed herself a breath. She was tired, yes, but steady, because sometimes the most incredible stories aren't about grand victories, but about staying rooted when everything around you tries to move you. And that was enough. One of the most powerful lessons from this story is that respect and dignity are not negotiable. They are fundamental rights. As we grow older and reflect on a lifetime of experiences, we understand that strength is not always shown through confrontation, but often through quiet courage and inner resolve. Maya Brooks did not raise her voice or seek attention. She simply stood her ground with grace and self-respect. This reminds us that there will always be moments in life when we are asked, directly or indirectly, to give in, to stay silent, or to yield for the comfort of others. But knowing when to say no is just as important as knowing when to compromise. Especially in today's world, where assumptions and judgments often come too quickly, holding on to our values is an act of wisdom. For older adults who have spent decades navigating life's challenges, this story reaffirms the importance of living with integrity, setting boundaries, and being unafraid to uphold what is right. Sometimes, the most meaningful impact we make is not by changing others, but by staying true to ourselves, calmly, quietly, and confidently. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to our channel for more powerful and inspiring content. Your support helps us bring more stories that matter to life. Thank you for watching.